Anyone who keeps white worms long enough eventually runs into the same problem. One day the culture looks healthy and active, and the next it seems overrun with tiny moving dots. Mites. They multiply fast, outcompete worms for food, foul the bedding, and if left unchecked, they can collapse an otherwise productive culture. The good news is that mite outbreaks are not random. They are caused by specific conditions, and once those conditions are corrected, control is completely achievable. This is not about nuking the culture with chemicals or starting over every time. The most reliable fixes come from understanding what mites need to thrive and systematically removing those advantages. Why mites appear in white worm cultures in the first place. Mites are opportunists. They do not appear unless conditions favor them more than the worms. In nearly every case, mite outbreaks trace back to excess food, excess moisture, or stagnant airflow. White worms prefer cool, moist, oxygen-rich bedding with modest feeding. Mites prefer warm, wet, and overfed environments. When food is allowed to sit uneaten, especially protein-rich foods like bread, soaked in milk or fish food, mites explode. They reproduce faster than worms and quickly dominate the surface. Once established, they form a feedback loop, consuming food before worms can reach it and further stressing the culture. Understanding that mites are a symptom rather than the core problem changes how you respond. The first correction is feeding discipline, not treatment. Overfeeding is the #1 trigger. White worms require surprisingly little food when temperatures are right. Feeding should always match consumption. If food is still visible after 24 to 48 hours, it was too much. Switching to smaller, more frequent feeding starves mites without starving worms. Worms can feed below the surface on microfilms and decomposing matter, while mites rely heavily on exposed food. Reducing exposed food immediately shifts the balance back in favor of the worms. Placing food on a small piece of plastic or glass, rather than directly on the bedding, also helps. This allows you to remove uneaten food cleanly before it becomes a mite breeding ground. Moisture control quietly solves half the problem. White worms need moisture, but they do not need saturation. Bedding that drips when squeezed is already too wet. Excess moisture creates anaerobic pockets and fungal growth that mites tolerate better than worms. If mites are present, allow the top layer of bedding to dry slightly. This does not mean letting the culture dry out completely. It means reducing surface moisture while keeping deeper layers cool and damp. Mites congregate near the surface and suffer first when conditions dry slightly. Adding dry bedding such as coconut coir peat or shredded cardboard absorbs excess moisture and dilutes mite populations without disturbing worms. Temperature is an overlooked control lever. White worms thrive best between 55 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Mites prefer warmer conditions. Cultures kept at room temperature are far more prone to infestations. Lowering the temperature slows mite reproduction dramatically while leaving worms largely unaffected. Even a shift of 5 degrees can tip the balance. Many successful keepers, move cultures to basements, unheated rooms, or even refrigerators set just above freezing. Now, cold isn't actually a treatment. It's more of a selective pressure that, tends to favor the worms. When mites are visible on the surface, manual removal becomes effective, especially if it's paired with other corrections. Using a damp paper towel laid on the surface will attract mites. They climb onto it, seeking moisture and food. The towel can then be removed and discarded. So this method works best when repeated daily for a short period while feeding is reduced. It won't, eliminate mites entirely on its own, but it can significantly reduce their numbers and give your worms a bit of breathing room. You'll want to avoid stirring the bedding aggressively. Doing that just spreads mites deeper into the culture and honestly stresses out the worms. In severe infestations, partial bedding replacement is sometimes necessary, but the key thing is never to replace everything at once. White worms are really sensitive to sudden changes. Right, so you'll want to remove about 1/3 of the bedding, focusing mainly on the top layer where mites tend to concentrate. Replace this with fresh, moist bedding and, repeat the process weekly until the culture stabilizes. Worms naturally migrate downward, and recolonize the clean areas, while mite populations drop with each removal. This way, you preserve the microbial balance that worms rely on, all while steadily removing mite habitat. Now, certain foods, especially soft, sugary or dairy-heavy ones, are like magnets for mites. Switching to firmer foods such as soaked grains, plain bread without milk, or, simple vegetable scraps really helps to reduce mite interest. Some keepers have reported a bit of success using slightly acidic foods, since mites tolerate acidity less well than worms do. The effect is subtle, but when you combine it with other measures, it does contribute to overall balance. The idea isn't to poison the mites, but rather to make the environment less comfortable for them than for the worms. Mites will always be present at low levels. A completely sterile culture just isn't realistic or, frankly, healthy. The real goal is to maintain conditions where worms naturally outcompete the mites. That balance really comes from restrained, feeding-controlled moisture, cool temperatures, and, of course, routine observation. Healthy worm cultures tend to regulate themselves, and mite outbreaks only occur when that balance is disturbed. Once you understand this, mite problems stop being emergencies and instead become signals, actually, telling you exactly what needs adjustment. And when those adjustments are made, the culture recovers. No collapse, no need to restart.